Welcome, everyone, to the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics, The Marginal Revolution. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy. We're now on Lecture 16, Carl Menger. This is now Part 2. All right, so Lecture 15 was Part 1 of Menger, and now we're wrapping things up. In the previous lecture, we spent a lot of time laying the foundation, but it's in this lecture that we're going to actually get to some of Menger's actual work. Before, we mostly just gave an overview of the marginal revolution. Everything I said in that lecture would be true of Menger's contributions, but I kept it somewhat abstract and didn't really focus on Menger's particular exposition per se. Also, let me say that for this particular lecture later on in it, I'm going to be going through Menger's particular graphical exposition of the ranking of preferences based on different types of goods and the unit of the good in question. And for that, it's going to be difficult for you just to be listening to this. It's going to be helpful if you're looking at the PowerPoint as I'm walking through it. So that's going to be a little bit later in the lecture, just to give you a heads up on that. Okay, so to remind you, Carl Menger himself was 1840 to 1921. And of course, his principles book, the Grundsatz, came out in 1871. And that's the thing that really founded the Austrian school. Let me spend a moment just explaining to you the significance of the book and why Carl Menger really was original. And we can quite unambiguously say that this was the foundation of the Austrian school. So, for example, Joseph Schumpeter in his magisterial History of Economic Analysis, when he's talking about this period, he says that Menger is nobody's pupil. All right, and so what Schumpeter means by that is it's not as if you can identify, who was the precursor to Carl Menger? Who was the person that Menger studied? Whose works did he read? And then that's where Menger started out from, and then Menger just took the baton a little bit further down and then published his book in 1871. No, there's really nothing like that. To be sure, it's not as if Menger had been locked in a closet his whole life, came out and said, hey, you know what? Let's start talking about marginal utility. That's not what I'm saying. But more so than other economists that we're going to be studying, really Menger's contribution here, and remember, he, along with Jevons and Walras, is considered one of the three discoverers of the marginal utility principle in terms of modern value and price theory. Menger, more than those other two, really just gave a new framework that he invented. And so that's what Schumpeter means when he says Menger is nobody's pupil. And then, as I say, quite clearly, every historian of economic thought would, when you say, when did the Austrian school get formed, he would say, well, it was created with Menger's 1871 book, that all the early Austrians would clearly admit, oh yeah, the reason we think the way we do is because of Menger's book. That's where we got these ideas. Mises said at one point that it was reading Menger's Principles book that made an economist of him. It was that book that got Mises to realize, okay, yes, this is the way to view the world now, and everything now is much clearer to me now that I've read this book, and now I know how to think like an economist. Another way of seeing this, I think it's quite fair to interpret the work of Menger's immediate disciples, namely Wieser and Böhm-Bawerk, as being simply applying the Mengerian framework to particular topics. So Menger himself, in this Principles book, did not cover all of economic theory. And he didn't think he was. In Menger's mind, originally, he thought this book was going to cover the basics of the theory of the good. We might, in modern terminology, say Menger was covering demand theory and how the isolated individual acts and values items and so forth, and coming up with the determination of price ratios among consumption goods, but that Menger did not move into production theory. And he didn't really spend too much time on monetary theory, capital and interest, things like that, which a modern work in Austrian economics, a treatise, would have to cover all those things. But Menger intended to come back to those topics, and he couldn't get around to it because of things happening in his life. So Wieser and Bavark, we could plausibly interpret their whole career as merely taking the Mengerian framework, this new approach to economic issues that Carl Menger basically invented off the top of his head, and then applying it to other areas. In particular, we're going to talk about this more when we deal with Bavark, but I have always thought that it was the way to understand what Bavark did in his work on capital and interest was to take Mengerian value and price theory, which Menger had applied in his own writings to a static, current time period analysis. Like, how would Menger explain why a pound of steak, has a higher market price right now than a current pound of hamburger meat? And Menger would give you an explanation. And then Bavark said, okay, really what interest is the fact that a pound of steak today has a higher market value than a pound of steak that won't be delivered until 10 years from now. And so how do I explain that disparity in market prices? Well, we already know how to explain that. We use Mengerian price theory that involves subjective marginal utility. That's how I'll explain it. All right, so I've always thought that that's the way to understand Bavark, is that he was taking what Menger had done and just applying it in a different context that was a little more analytically difficult. Okay, let's talk now about the theory of the good. So this might sound like it has to do with philosophy or something, right? You might imagine Aristotle talking about the theory of the good, but no, obviously here we don't mean ethical behavior or how should one live one's life. We mean goods in an economic context. So Menger gives us prerequisites for an item to have goods character. Number one, there has to be a human need or a desire that's unsatisfied. Number two, this object must have certain properties that could satisfy or at least partially diminish that human need. Three, the human mind must grasp this causal connection, right? So humans must be aware of the fact that this physical item has the ability, technologically or physically, of helping to satisfy or alleviate their need or their desire. And four, humans must be in a position to take advantage of this knowledge, right? So they have to actually have sufficient control or command over the object in order to be able to exploit the fact that it can help satisfy their need, and they know that it can. So all those four elements are required in order for a particular item to have goods character. But even there, the item might still just be a free good, not necessarily an economic good, right? So a cubic foot of air in general circumstances has those four things true of it, and so it's a good, but it doesn't have market value. It's free. And that's because air is not scarce, right? Typically, there's enough units of air to satisfy all our needs so that any particular unit, we don't attach importance to it. We could take it or leave it. Incidentally, Lionel Robbins remarked, I was reading his discussion of Menger, Robbins thinks that if we had to pick an economist who really associated economic science with scarcity and really put those two together, that it would be Carl Menger. So obviously, people before Menger had discussed scarcity and understood that was an important element of economic thought or economic analysis. But Robbins said if you had to pick one economist who really understood that everything we do in economics ultimately derives from the fact of scarcity, and that's what distinguishes economizing behavior from other aspects of life, the condition of scarcity, Robbins says he thinks Menger was the one that really nailed that down and stressed that element more than any of his predecessors. Okay, let me just spend a minute here discussing the distinction between value and utility in Menger's framework. Because what you're going to find is nowadays when economists talk about price theory, they'll just use marginal utility and value, and they'll throw these terms around, and you would think that they're saying basically the same thing, and that there's all the same kind of term. In the original foundational works in the Austrian school, that's not correct, right? They're distinct terms. I'm not necessarily saying it's worth you really getting into it and understanding the distinctions, but it was important for them when they're creating this theory and correcting what they thought were confusions, or at least poor terminological choices in the British classical tradition. It was really important for them to be, if you will, really precise and nitpicky. But in any event, I just don't want you to be confused. If you start reading the principles of Menger, or you read perhaps Böhm-Bawerk's work on basic value and price theory, you might hit some passages that sound odd to you if you've been taught that value and marginal utility are the same thing, or that value and utility are basically interchangeable terms, because for these people they weren't. So I'm not going to dwell on this. I'll read you one passage to show you what I mean, and then I'm going to move on. But again, I'm just bringing your attention to this so you don't get confused if you start reading some of the stuff in the original and you see stuff you weren't expecting. So here is Menger, and I'm coming in mid-sentence. The error underlying the confusion of utility and use value has had no influence on the practical activity of men. At no time has an economizing individual attributed value under ordinary circumstances to a cubic foot of air. And then a little bit later, the practical man distinguishes very well the capacity of an object to satisfy one of his needs from its value. But this confusion has become an enormous obstacle to the development of the more general theories of our science. Okay, so again, what Menger is talking about is that the way the British classical economists were trying to develop their theory of value, that they were just running into confusion. So part of it has to do, of course, with the issue of the marginal aspect. But I'm just, again, warning you, you start reading this, you'll see that value and utility mean different things in the Mengerian framework. Okay, now something that's much more standard and that you're not going to be confused by if you're reading it in Menger. He classifies goods according to their orders. So the first order or the lowest order goods are the consumption goods, right? They're the things that directly satisfy the human desires or needs. Then you start moving up into higher order goods in the Mengerian framework. And these are the things that are combined in order to make lower order goods. So, for example, goods that you combine to directly produce first order goods, those things you would call second order goods. And then the factors of production that you use in order to make second order goods, well, those are called third order goods, right? So the higher the order, the more remote you are from the ultimate consumption good that is directly satisfying the human need. So you can come up with different examples of this to illustrate the point. Let me just give you a simple one. And of course, I'm simplifying all of this just for the purposes of this lecture. But for example, you might say a loaf of bread that somebody's going to eat, that's a first order good, right? So the human need there is hunger. The bread has the physical properties of being able to satisfy the hunger, at least temporarily. The human is aware of that. The human sees the bread and realizes, oh yeah, I'm hungry right now. That bread, I know if I put that in my mouth and swallow it, that's going to make my stomach stop rumbling. And the human has sufficient control over the object, right? It's not that the bread is behind some bulletproof glass that nobody can figure out how to get through, that the human's able to get at it. And so that's why that bread has goods character, and in fact, it's a first order good. Now, where does that bread come from? Well, you could talk about the flour and the labor of the baker and the oven necessary to bake the bread. So you might call the flour and the baker's labor and the oven second order goods, right? So flour per se, I suppose unless you were really desperate, you're not going to use that to satisfy your hunger, right? No one's going to sit there and just try to eat the flour directly. but you would value the flour if you're hungry, or if you know you're going to be hungry down the road. You would attribute importance to that flour because you would realize, oh, wait a minute, I can use this flour to make bread, and I know that bread is a first order good that I would value because it would satisfy my hunger. So that's why you're going to attribute value to the flour. All right, so notice how the importance of things is based on looking down through the pipeline of production to what they're ultimately going to do in terms of consumption. But flour doesn't just come from nowhere. And so where did it come from? Well, you might say, okay, wheat, the labor of the miller, and a grain mill, the device that you use to turn the wheat into flour, those could all be third order goods, right? Because you use all those in order to make flour. So again, seeing a grain mill, you might say, well, gee, I'm hungry. What the heck is a grain mill going to have to do with my hunger? I can't eat that thing. I don't just push a button and a sandwich comes out. So what is it? Well, because oh, wait a minute, I can use this in combination with other things in order to produce flour. I can use that in combination with other second order goods in order to make the loaf of bread. All right, so the things that are used to make the second order good are themselves third order goods. Okay, now we're at the point where it would be very helpful if you're looking at the diagram that I've got in the PowerPoint. I'm going to have this slide. There's little animations here just to walk through this step by step. But in case you're not looking at this, let me at least just give you the big picture. Menger has this diagram where there's a bunch of columns of numbers, and in the top row, so like the headings of the columns, are Roman numerals. So the top left is a Roman numeral 1. You go to the right, there's a Roman numeral 2. You go to the right, there's a Roman numeral 3, all the way up through Roman numeral 9. And then in each column, there's Arabic numerals. So for column 1, that's underneath Roman numeral 1, it starts at the top with 10, then underneath it's a 9, underneath it's an 8, and so on, all the way down to 0. Then you go to the right in the second column. Now that first row, or like the row under the title, starts with a 9, then there's an 8, a 7, a 6, and so on, all the way down to 0. The next, go to the right, that one starts with an 8 and goes to 0. So the thing looks like a triangle because each column has one fewer number than the previous column because they keep starting at a lower number. So this is the way Menger is trying to show the various rankings of different units of different types of goods. So the Roman numerals represent different classes of goods that can satisfy different types of needs. So for him, the Roman numeral 1, he says that could be food, whereas the Roman numeral 5, that's tobacco. And then the fact that the food has a 10 there, that should help us realize that these Arabic numeral rankings have to do with the relative importance. All right, so they're not like measurements of units of utility. It's just their rankings. So a 10 is the most important thing. So these things are ranked with 0 meaning it's not important and 10 meaning it's extremely important. Namely, it's the difference between life and death. And then 9 means, oh, this is something that is pretty important, but it's not life or death. But it's way more important than something that's 0. All right? And so what that means is the person, it wouldn't make sense to say, oh, so this person with these value scales or these rankings of preferences, does he think food or tobacco is more important? That's a nonsense question. That's like saying, is water or diamonds more important? You can't answer a question like that because you're never in a position, well, you're normally in a position of choosing between all the water and all the diamonds. In practical action, everyday life, you're choosing between specific quantities of various types of goods. And that's the insight underlying all of the marginal revolution. That was the problem that was stumping the classical economists. Their framework didn't have that subtlety embedded in it where they were analyzing particular units of goods, and that's why they kept hitting a brick wall and reaching absurdities and just having to kind of hand wave and do little explanations in any particular case, but their framework itself really wasn't very helpful. So here, Menger shows us that it doesn't make sense to say, is food or tobacco more valuable to this person? You'd have to say, well, how many units of food and tobacco do we have right now? So the first unit of food is more important than the first unit of tobacco, way more important. And in fact, the first 4 units of food are more important than that first unit of tobacco, right? Because it's the 10, 9, 8, 7 of those first 4 units of food, right? So that very first unit of food has a ranking of a 10 because that's the difference between life or death. So once the person eats that, he's not going to starve to death, but he still would rather get a second unit of food rather than the first unit of tobacco. And it's only after he gets the 4th unit of food, such that now if he got a 5th unit, that has a ranking of 6 on his levels of importance. And the first unit of tobacco also has a ranking of 6. And so now they're comparable. All right, so once he has those first 4 units of food in his possession, then he said, okay, now I'm starting to think maybe I want to get some tobacco because I have enough food to satisfy, to stave off hunger and to make me not really, really be hungry and to maybe keep my stomach from growling as he's getting more and more units of food. And at some point, if he had to choose between just one unit, either of additional food or his first unit of tobacco, he might say at some point, you know what? Yeah, that'd be good to have a smoke right now. So in particular, if we thought the individual could only get 15 units total of all these different types of goods, these 9 different types of goods, because remember the Roman numerals go from 1 to 9, there's 9 columns total in this diagram. If we told the individual, you get to pick 15 total units, what do you want? Well, giving these rankings, the individual would take 5 units of food, he would take 4 units of whatever Roman numeral 2 is, 3 units of whatever 3 is, 2 units of whatever 4 is, and then that first unit of 5, which we know is tobacco. And so there'd be 15 total units, and I've got a little triangle on the PowerPoint here if you're following along there to see which ones it would be. So make sure you walk through and understand the logic of that. So just to give you a hint, it's because what the individual is trying to do at any moment is satisfy the most important end or goal that is yet unsatisfied, as he's getting an additional unit at his disposal. So if he's only got 15 total that he can grab, he would not even take that first unit of, say, good Roman numeral 8, whatever that is, because even the first unit of that just has an importance ranking of 3. And so he would still be spending his time on the earlier types of goods, the ones over to the left on the diagram, because the earlier units of those things are more important than even that first unit of good Roman numeral 8. Okay, let me now spend the rest of this lecture talking about Menger's theory of the origin of money. He had, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, he had a journal article on this, and for a while, Menger was just the authority on this, right? That economists acknowledge that yet Menger has written the most satisfactory account of the origin of money. It was a theoretical account, but it sort of has to be, right? And so you'll understand what I mean when I first just say, what are the problems with what we might call the state theory of money? All right, so somebody who just thinks, well, we have this social institution that's obviously very important to humanity, money, and it's not natural, right? It's not like saying, well, where did trees come from? And we could either say God or evolution or whatever, depending on what your worldview is. But with money, clearly humans invented it. And yet it's an odd thing, right? Isn't it sort of weird that on one half of every transaction we accept things that we don't intend to use directly, that we just accept them because we plan on trading them away again. And it's really weird when we talk about modern fiat money that's issued by states that is intrinsically not useful for much at all, right? Isn't it weird that you would go and work in the hot sun all day in order for someone to give you a $50 bill when, what am I going to do with this thing? I don't want to eat it. I could maybe light it on fire for some temporary light or warmth, but not much. Is that really worth working all day for? And you say, oh, well, the reason you're accepting that $50 bill in exchange for your hard labor all day is because you're going to go spend it somewhere else. You know that other people would give you valuable stuff, things that you really want, in exchange for that green piece of paper with a 50 printed on it. So it seems odd that you would do something that on the surface of it is dumb just because you're trusting that, oh, other people are going to reciprocate and they're going to do something equally dumb. And that's why it makes sense for me to do it. Right? So, again, the institution of money, especially when we're thinking of it in the context of state-issued fiat money, it's odd. It's an odd practice. And yet we know that it actually is essential to modern civilization. When we get to Ludwig von Mises in the second part of this Liberty Classroom course, we'll walk over that more specifically of how monetary calculation is crucial to Western civilization. It's not just that money helps make things a little bit easier, greases the wheels of commerce. Money is absolutely essential. But yet, as I say, it's odd when you just look at it and pretend for a minute you don't know how it works. It's a weird practice. So a lot of people in such a situation where there's something that's a social practice that's quite useful and that was clearly developed by humans, it's not just a biological instinct or something, their natural response is to say, oh, well, the state must have created this or mandated it, or some wise chief that was ruling the tribe way back in the day must have just announced this and everybody followed the rules. But there's problems with that kind of theory of the origin of money. So for one thing, there's no record of it. You would think if some king thousands of years ago just woke up one day and said, it's kind of crazy that my people are using barter transactions. Why don't we start using money? Hey, everyone, from now on, we're using money. And then that kingdom would blow away all of its competitors because they were using money and everybody else was still engaging in barter. You think that king would go down in history as the wisest person ever, but we don't have a record of that. And no, Eddie Money's family did not invent money. So that's one mystery or one problem with the theory that says some wise political official must have invented it. Another problem is just the audacity of such an invention that, again, if you didn't have direct experience with it, the idea of money is kind of crazy. Imagine that if people are engaged in barter transactions where everybody is just accepting things that they intend to use personally, what we might more accurately call direct exchange, because the term barter is a little bit ambiguous, but direct exchange meaning where everyone just plans on either directly consuming or using in production the thing they're getting from the other party when they engage in a trade. If that's what everybody's doing, and then someone comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, I bet you, what if from now on, follow me here on this, folks, what if every time you go to sell something, you want to trade away something, you accept something that you actually don't want. You don't want to consume it, and you don't even want to use it in production. But you're going to just trade it away down the road. If we can all agree to do that, look at how much better off we'll be. I mean, I think people would look at you like you were nuts. It'd be as if you came along and invented your own new language and tried to get everybody to start using your new language from scratch and just explain to them, hey, if we all tomorrow flip to this new language, look at how better it'll be because our current language is kind of inefficient or unwieldy. I mean, I think they would look at you like you were crazy. Okay, so the idea of someone just inventing money is implausible because until you experienced it yourself and saw its advantages and how it worked, it would be unlikely that the human mind could conceive of such a thing, let alone convince other people about it. Another problem with the theory saying that the state or some wise religious figure or somebody must have invented this. Let's stipulate for the sake of argument that some wise ruler did wake up one day and realized, you know what? Instead of everybody engaging in direct exchange, I want everyone to, and he grabs a seashell off the shore and says, everybody from now on, when you sell things, you have to take these seashells as the payment, even though they're not useful for anything. And so we're going to go around and start collecting these things, and this is what I want you to use. So that would not be enough. People would say, imagine you're someone who normally sells a horse in exchange for, 50 eggs to your neighbor. Your neighbor down the street has chickens producing eggs. You breed horses, and every once in a while you trade a horse to your neighbor for 50 eggs. And then the king announces, from now on, when you trade something, you got to accept shells in exchange. So now you want to sell a horse, and you need to know, okay, well, how many shells should I take in exchange? And somebody's willing to, somebody else is willing to say, oh, I'll buy your horse. I want a horse. Okay. And here's 3 shells for it. Is that okay? And now you're the horse seller. How do you know if it's okay? Because really what you wanted was 50 eggs. So you have to know, well, I need to know what my neighbor is selling 50 eggs for in terms of shells. But your neighbor's in the same position. He's afraid to sell, just like you as the horse seller don't know. Right? So the problem there is you don't know what the purchasing power of the shells are. And so it's not enough just to say, okay, everybody, let's designate this item as the money commodity. The ruler also, to really get things off the ground, would have to start dictating explicit price ratios to say a horse sells for this many shells. It wouldn't be enough just to say, everyone sell your stuff for shells at this point, because everybody would be afraid to move first because they wouldn't know how much the thing was worth. Okay, so what about Menger's theory? I'm going to walk through this somewhat quickly in the interest of time, but you'll notice what I want you to see is Menger's story evades all the problems I just gave you. It may have looked like I just explained to you why it's impossible to come up with a theory of money, and we're stumped and like, gee, we've got this institution, everybody's doing it. It was clearly invented by humans, but it looks like it couldn't have been invented by humans. What the heck? We'll watch Menger's theory. So his first insight is to say, even in a state of barter, or more accurately, direct exchange, nonetheless, different types of goods would have different degrees of what we might translate from his original work as saleability. In our terminology, we might say marketability or liquidity might be terms that would more accurately convey what Menger was trying to get at there. So notice this is not the same thing as value. So for example, if you're a house, in modern times here, a house could be quite valuable, have a high market value, but it's not very liquid. A house, you might say, is worth $200,000. Someone says, hey, what's your house worth? $200,000. What do you mean by that? Does that mean that next Tuesday you could sell your house and have $200,000 now in your checking account? No. When you say what your house is worth, what you mean is, if I cleaned it up, I got a realtor, I went through all the things, had showings, and gave myself 3 or 4 months maybe, and especially waited for the optimal time to put houses on the market, then I think I could sell it for $200,000, give or take. That's what you mean. So there's a long process to turn the house into the cash that you think it's, quote, worth. Whereas you have a $10 bill and someone says, how much is that worth in dollars? Well, you'd say $10 because it's almost a truism. Maybe something not so obvious, a share of corporate stock. If you said, how much is that stock worth? You'd say, oh, you'd look it up online. Oh, it's $60.14 right now. Okay. You could sell it pretty quickly for $60.14. All right, you wouldn't have to wait 3 months because corporate stock is very liquid. So again, Menger is pointing out some items, some goods are very liquid, meaning they have a wide market. It wouldn't be hard for you to sell the thing and get what its, quote, full value is, or fair value, again in quotation marks, I don't mean ethically, for that thing. So if you want a more accurate definition, it means the highest price you're likely to get for the item, how long would you have to be marketing it in order to receive that price, right? So you could sell your house by next Tuesday, but you'd probably have to discount it heavily. Or said in other words, if you give me 3 months to sell a house, I can get a much better price for it than if you only give me a week. Whereas if you give me a long time to sell a share of corporate stock, it's not that I'm going to get a better buyer if I search long enough. The only reason I might get more is just because the actual market price might happen to go up in the meantime if I'm waiting. But it's not that I got to keep looking and looking to hope to find just that right buyer for my share of corporate stock, because no, the market for that is very liquid. All right, so even back before money, this principle still exists. And so somebody who's going to market with a cow to sell is in a much better position than someone going to market with an exquisite telescope. The telescope, if it's really fancy and so on, might actually have a higher market value than the cow, but maybe there's only at any given time 16 people on planet Earth who want to buy a telescope like that, and you'd have to find them. Whereas lots of people on any given day in any given market of a near a city of adequate size, you're going to find somebody who wants to buy a cow and is willing to pay you, quote, the fair full market price for a cow. Okay, so now that you have that notion in mind, Menger pointed out, okay, so someone going to market with a relatively illiquid commodity may not find somebody who actually wants that thing as the final sale. And at the same time has what the person wants. Right? So let's say you're going to market with a telescope and what you want are eggs. And you think that you've studied past transactions and so on, studied the market, and you think that a fair price, that you're hoping to get 10,000 eggs for this exquisite telescope that perhaps you've spent years constructing, making sure the lenses are correctly ground and so forth and the focus is right. And this is a wonder. This is a beautiful telescope. There's only like 100 of these things on Earth. That's how awesome this telescope is. So you want to get thousands of eggs in order to satisfy that. What are the chances on any given day you're going to go out and find a farmer who has a bunch of chickens and wants one of those telescopes and has that many eggs to give to you? The chance of that happening and you finding that person are basically zero. And so what are you going to do? You're not just going to throw up your hands. Instead, you're going to try to find anybody who's willing to give you a lot of stuff with high market value that's more liquid than your telescope. And you're going to accept that as an intermediate step on your journey, as a stepping stone, a means to an end. So you see somebody who says, hey, I'll give you 18 horses for that telescope. And you might think about it and look at the horses and so on and think, yeah, I'm much more likely to get what I really want, thousands of eggs, if I'm walking around with 18 horses and trying to find somebody who has a bunch of eggs and wants horses than I am to find somebody who has a bunch of eggs and wants this telescope. So you might agree to that, even though you hate horses. You're not going to ride them. It's not that you have plows or something that you could make the horse drag around. I mean, there's nothing you can do with the horse. You're only accepting them because you plan on trying to find someone who has eggs that you'll trade away. Or maybe you won't even find the eggs. Maybe you'll find somebody else who has something that's more convenient for you and more liquid, like bars of gold. And then you say, oh, yeah, I'd actually, instead of walking these horses around, these things are a pain to keep track of. The telescope was really illiquid, but at least it wasn't going to the bathroom on the floor. At least I didn't have to feed it. Whereas these horses, the longer my search continues, the bigger a pain it is to be carrying these things around. And so you see someone who's got bars of gold and is willing to give you a, quote, fair market price for your horse, your 18 horses. Oh, yeah, sure. All right, and so you see how that process works, that you start accepting things that are more liquid, and part of what's influencing your judgment as to whether I want to accept things or not is you're not merely thinking about the liquidity, you're also taking into account other things like, how much of a pain is it going to be for me to carry this around? Or if I get to the final transaction and I need to only give them some of what I'm holding because maybe I'm going to split it up over 5 different transactions, right? Maybe I'm not going to find one person with all the eggs. Maybe I got to do it with different people who want some of it. Is the thing I have easily divisible, right? So that's part of the explanation for how gold and silver came to be the monies. But let me focus right now just on this issue of liquidity. Notice that in this example, the horses originally were more liquid, more marketable than the fancy telescope. But then the horse's liquidity or marketability increased when I, as the telescope seller, agreed to accept those horses as a means to an end, right? So originally, I was not part of the market for horses. I don't want horses. I can't use them in any way. So someone who's breeding horses and trying to sell them at first would not consider me somebody who would be willing to accept them in trade. But because the horses are more marketable than my telescope, maybe I would be willing to accept them. And so see how the market for horses just went up by one person because of their initial advantage in liquidity. So that principle is kind of showing the snowball effect, that things that originally started out and that were more marketable than other things, that fact by itself made their marketability even higher. And so that process continues over time. But again, it's not merely the marketability, it's also other properties that would affect the increase in marketability, such that eventually all these things interacting with each other, Menger says one or more commodities would become so marketable that in fact in a given region, just about anybody you're going to bump into in the marketplace would be willing to accept that thing in exchange. And so historically, gold and silver achieved this status in lots of places where anybody going to market is willing, if they could find someone with gold or silver and be willing to buy the thing you want to get rid of, you would say, oh, yeah, sure, I'll take the gold or silver because I'm not going to have any problem getting what I ultimately want with the gold and silver as long as what you're giving me is a, quote, fair market price. And so nobody would object to accepting gold or silver, but that's what money is. If something is perfectly acceptable in any transaction for the people in a given region, that's what it means to say that thing is money for those people. That is Menger's theory of the origin of money. And again, notice that does not suffer from any of the problems we mentioned with the state theory of money. And so it's just one of the many things that Menger contributed to economic science. That's all the time we have for today. We'll see you next time.